And then I will admit everyone. Hello, everyone. So we are waiting for people to join the meeting. We have in the meantime switched from a webinar format to a meeting format to allow a more interactive discussion. So bear with us while we admit everyone. Okay. Okay. I think we can start. So, thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. This is an RDA4EOSC webinar that is focused on organizational approaches to enhancing skills and improving training. My name is Michellebacher. I work with the Digital Repository of Ireland and the RDA4EOSC project. Just a few housekeeping points. We are recording this session. As I said, we've moved from a webinar format to a meeting format to allow a little bit of a more interactive discussion. So you'll be able to use the chat for your question, but also feel free to raise your hand. We can unmute and have a more interactive conversation about the topic. So we're going to start with setting a little bit the scene from more of an RDA4EOSC perspective. Then Michellebacher is going to speak to us about the OECD work and the report on building digital workforce capacity and skills for data-intensive science. And then Irina Kuchma is going to speak to us more from an EOSC perspective and the report of the Working Group on Skills and Training on Digital Skills, Fair and Open Science. We're going to close with a short discussion and Q&A. So as I mentioned, to give you a little bit of a background of what RDA4EOSC aims to do with this activity. So one of the pillars of this initiative focuses on organizations, and we have tried to look at what organizations can do to improve their engagement with EOSC. Skills and training, as you can see, has been one of the top areas or topics that have been identified as with a need to be addressed. So we are developing a series of policy briefs, and we are organizing these webinars in order to facilitate the dialogue and the knowledge exchange. And we are focusing specifically on organizations. So as I mentioned, we have a policy brief that focuses on the organizational approaches to enhancing skills and improving training. You can find it on the RDA website. There are links on your screen, and we will be sharing also the slides and other links that are recorded on them. So you would be able to see the content at a later point in time. So the policy brief focuses on issues related to the challenges. It also discusses the training and the skills in the context of other research comments, and is trying to also highlight a few of the recommendations for organizations. Recommendations like looking at developing a comprehensive organizational skills and training policies, and how that can be connected to the wider range of policies focusing on research data management in order to ensure a coherent and meaningful way of connecting the processes and policies internal to one organization. Another thing to highlight would be the recommendation of utilizing common frameworks and curricula when these strategies and programs are being developed. And Michelle and Irina will touch upon some of the work that has been done in this area. Recommending also tilling training and skills development to the performance evaluation as a means to ensure that there is a wider buy-in inside an organization, focusing on investments and prioritizing skills, and aiming to try to bring all this together in national and wider international context from an organizational perspective, so as to ensure that organizations are up to speed on some of the developments and on the wider strategies that are in place at national and international levels. So some of the points in these recommendations will be addressed by Michelle and Irina, but from, as I mentioned, from a slightly different perspective. And we'll look forward to having a wider discussion as we go along towards the end of the webinar. But before we do that, we would like to have a short Menti poll to understand who's in the audience, just to see the type of organizations that are represented, your role and interest in the topic, and just to try to see who's well, what are the things that have brought you here today? So then Michelle and Irina can understand and tailor a little bit better the messaging that they're presenting. So let me try in the meantime to move on to the Menti. So you can see on your screen the code 45901950. The first question relates to your organization type. So are you representing a research performing organization, research funding organization, one that provides services for research, maybe a governmental agency, a publisher, private sector organization, and maybe there are categories that we haven't actually covered in these categories. So there's also the option of other. So we already have 21 answers. Most of our participants come from research performing organizations or organizations that provide services for research. We have a couple of representatives also from government, publishers, and private sector. Mostly I see we have research performing organization and research providing organization. We'll keep the Menti open, so please feel free to come back to this question, to come back to the Menti also during the webinar. What is your role? It's very, you have two options to sort of define your role or position, and we're hoping we can build the tech cloud with the answers. So very interesting: change agent, advisor, project manager, research associate, research data management lead, research associate, already read that, bioinformatician. So we have also very specific researchers, knowledge manager, policy leader, research technologist, which is not surprising considering that a lot of the participants come from organizations that serve and provide services to the research community. Research data manager, governance officer, professor, engagement manager, very important as well, data librarian, policy analyst, Deputy Vice President, Open Science, very specific, librarian, trainer, very important category, research data management consultant. Thank you all for that. That's very interesting to see the variety of roles that our participants have. Just to move on to the next question, we would like to see what your interest in the topic is. I mean, I'm assuming based on the various roles that some of you are either directly involved in programs of skills and training, or are here just to see what the development in the area might be. Some of you might hold yes, of course, guidance on developing training. Some of you might hold a position that is more strategic and is related to developing an organizational strategy for this. So we already have a few answers: skills and methods for data management and training, ideas for skill development and training. See what happened elsewhere, so we're not reinventing the wheel. That's very important, and that's why we were hoping to bring forward some perspectives from the OECD group working on this, as well as the one with under EOSC. So policy insight, strategic training, skills development of research data management support, further integration of platform and services, information about research data management training, knowledge improvement about training, scaling up training to ECRs and data stewards, finding good examples of organizations implementing change, working out how the national organizations could build research data management capabilities. So you're going to hear during our webinar a little bit more about what it means to build organizational capabilities, so that that hopefully will meet the interest. Internationally recognized and accepted skills and development training programs. So creating national awareness, how to do that. That's also very important. Competence development, enforce homogeneous knowledge. Yes, scaling, we've already touched upon that. Organizing open research data for your university. This is very interesting. I mean, all of these will help us shape a little bit better the discussion around the topic. Also to understand your interest and approach in this webinar, we thought we would also like ask you another question that that would lighten a little bit the mood without taking away the seriousness of the topic. Well, we have a pair of slippers. And myself, I'm wearing socks as well. Birkenstocks, okay. So that Crocs, very interesting. I think that's a common choice in this period. Trainers, well, an interesting match with well, our topic. Very interesting. Okay, there seems to be quite a good overlap, considering we have now 22 answers and less than 10. So people are wearing similar things. That's very interesting. So thank you again for playing along and for your answers to the mentee. As I said, I'm now going to pass the floor to Michelle Barber, who is the director of the Research Software Alliance, and she has chaired the OECD Global Science Forum Expert Group on Digital Skills, the group that has developed the report on building digital workforce capability and skills for data-intensive science. So, Michelle, I'll pass the floor.
Thanks, Tamia. Thank you.
Present mode.
Fantastic, and great to see so many people here today. I'm Michellebacher, and I'm the director of the Research Software Alliance. But what I'll be talking about for the next 5 or 10 minutes is some work that I led in the OECD on understanding how to build digital workforce capacity and skills for the research sector. Next slide, thanks to Mia. Is there back one?
Nope. Oh, sorry, yes.
Sure. So to introduce this work generally, what the work of the OECD and particularly the Global Science Forum does, which is a part of OECD, which leads studies like these, is to make recommendations to policymakers. So what I'm talking about here is the really high level strategic approaches that hopefully will be useful to many of you when you're thinking about how to argue for increased funding or increased prioritization or resources or focus on skills and training or broader workforce building initiatives. Some of the more detailed things that some of you are asking for in the Menti around what's happening in particular schools best practice or what other training organisations might be doing. We might be able to go into more detail in Irina's presentation on the EOSC recommendations, and some of that will also pick up at the end when we have a bit of discussion amongst us on who's doing what and some of the challenges. So this work that I led in the OECD aimed to make recommendations to policymakers, particularly on how to build digital workforce capacity based on analysis of best practice. So while I did some literature review, a lot of the work we did was looking at some of the leading international exemplars, which is that cluster of logos down in the bottom right-hand corner. And I know we have representatives from some of those organisations like the Carpentries, and I think I saw TU Delft in the registration list who may be here today. So they're fantastic organisations to look at their work, not only in our summary of it in the report, but to go directly and see some of what they're doing. Any OECD Global Science Forum work is supported by the Secretariat, so we have the benefit of their expertise. So we work with Carthage Smith, who's on the call today, and Yoshiaka Tamura. So our work was published a year ago, and I'll also talk at the end about a few more recent pieces. Next slide, thanks. In terms of the scope of recommendations that we're looking at, what we mean when we talk about data in intensive science and what roles we were focusing on, we split them into two distinct groups. Distinct's probably the wrong term. There's large overlaps and difficulty differentiating between them at times. Researchers and digital support professionals. Now, the types of skills that are needed by researchers can vary very widely, the extent to the skills that they need, because as we all know, people from different disciplines come out of their undergraduate degree with different levels of digital skills depending on their discipline. So as a general rule, although it's not always true, people, for example, coming out of astronomy or high energy physics are usually more likely to have inbuilt into their undergraduates some useful curriculum around digital skills, whereas some disciplines such as the humanities traditionally have less. So it's great to see that changing. And we also then looked at a group which we broadly call digital support professionals. There's all manner of names to describe that group, and they include roles such as data stewards or data curators, or research software engineers or data librarians. Again, there's a whole a range of terminology that's used. And one of the questions that we asked was, if we had to try and average out how many digital support professionals we need per researcher, what on earth could that figure be? Now, obviously, it's going to vary by discipline, and sometimes the level of seniority in a research group and how recently you've graduated and had access some of that more modern curriculum. But some of the work suggests that we might need 1 digital support professional to 20 researchers. What existed 2 years ago in the US, R1, which are research-intensive universities, some of the research-intensive universities, was only 2 data librarians per university. And in Australia, we could see 1 research data management advisor to 65 researchers and 1 software engineering advisor to 100 researchers. So it'd be fascinating to see how much that's changed in the last couple of years. Next slide, please. In terms of the work we did analysing the best practice that we'd seen in literature that was available, we identified recommendations or areas that needed to be focused on across 5 themes. So if you look at the actual report, this is a different coloration to the graphic you'll see in the report, but this one's a little bit easier to read on screen. So starting in the top right, we can see a light blue colour that one of the first areas is around defining the digital skills we need, the frameworks and the roles. There's still a lot of different frameworks out there and not a lot of consensus on exactly what's needed when and for who and why. Going around the circle, provision of training is there in red. And this is quite important because we tend to talk a lot about the need for digital upskilling and forget that we also need the trainers available to do that. And we haven't necessarily invested enough effort in that particular community. Going around the circle, community development is equally important. Once you've got a whole cohort of data librarians or research software engineers or undergraduates with certain skill sets, you need to provide opportunities for them to network with others, to learn from each other, to share best practice, etc. In the yellow, we can see career paths and reward structures being highlighted, and it's great to see that there's been quite a lot of work on that in the last couple of years with increasing focus on open science. And finally, in the dark blue in the top left, that whilst we have all these specific items, there needs to be some thinking at a meta level around some of the broader enablers that are needed, such as broader science policy, frameworks, and actions. Next slide. If you're looking at the report, we make recommendations to a number of different actors or stakeholders. So these are the 6 that the report looks at. But for this talk, I'm going to focus on the green one or blue one at the bottom, the research institutions and infrastructures. So it's handy that our identification of who's on the call showed that a lot of people were from research performing organisations and service organisations. So hopefully this is the kind of information you need. If not, there's other sections of the report that you can go and read. Next slide. So to give you an example of some of the recommendations that we made for universities, relatively simple things, but things that are still not necessarily happening or not happening to the degree that we need. That there needs to be a program for providing training to all the people in the research community, that there needs to be consideration of the new career paths and reward mechanisms, that there need to be communities of learners and communities of people in new roles, that whether it's at organisational level or team level or faculty level, there needs to be policies that support all of these endeavours, that they need to be based on some understanding of the need or of where your community is currently at and what the priority areas are for improvement. And whatever programs are in place need to be integrated across an organisation. That it's very useful to engage in international collaboration to learn from others. And finally, that it's fantastic to be able to share training materials and experiences because we're all going through the same journey together. Next slide. To give you a taste of some of the more detail that's then included in the report for each of the higher level recommendations we make for each of the stakeholders, we then go into this kind of detail. This is about the recommendations on career paths and reward structures for universities. So we go into some of the challenges and identify some more concrete actions that need to be considered. So again, this kind of resource not only can give you ideas on the actions, but can also perhaps help you by having some of the challenges identified so that you can successfully argue within your own context by what are the kind of problems that are being caused and how these actions can address them. Next slide. And then finally, from this report, it also includes a digital workforce maturity model, which is a very simple version of a maturity model, which just says any organisation, be it a national infrastructure body or a library, could use this model to self-assess where they're at. Level 1 is very simply none, only having awareness that some of this is needed. Level 1 is isolated approaches. And when we finished our work a year ago, we still saw most of the organisations that we talk with, aside from our exemplars, focusing more on isolated approaches. Level 2, we're beginning to see a few more organisations who have programs across those 5 areas of needs. And level 3, it was almost impossible to find any organisation a year or 2 ago who had this kind of an embedded focus where everything was coordinated and integrated across an organisation, and there were processes in place to ensure it kept changing and in response to evaluation. Next slide. So we wanted to ask you 2 questions related to that information. So if we go back to the menti.com, it's the same URL and code, so you should still be in the right website if you now go back to that. We'd like to know where your organisation is on the maturity model, or your faculty or team, or whatever organisational grouping you feel like you'd like to represent in this conversation. Have we still got the majority of people at level 1? Or are we moving to having a lot more at level 2? Have we got any truly international leaders here on level 3? In which case you should be giving this talk, because you will be absolutely groups that we should learn from. So interesting, we've still got the majority around level 1, but more around level 2 than we were seeing a year or 2 ago. That's fantastic, and we'll keep having that aspirational goal of us all getting to level 3. All right, and then the next Menti question. This one asks you to identify, of the 5 themes that I talked about, the pie chart with the different colours, which is the area in which your organisation is doing the least work at the moment? Where do you see the greatest need, the most inaction? Interesting to see career paths and reward structures take an early lead. And I think that would make sense that over the last year or 2, we really have seen a huge growth in understanding of the need to look at that issue. Interesting that the first column, defining needs, is really low, because there certainly had been a lot of work on that in the last 4 years. So maybe we're now leveraging off that and able to use existing definitions and frameworks instead of all reinventing our own. And great to see that the last column in green on enablers is fairly high as well. But obviously organisations are moving away from some of that piecemeal or grassroots approach to really thinking about how to change the entire culture. So thanks everyone for those contributions. If we could go back to the slides, I'll just talk briefly about a couple of more recent reports that the OECD has produced. And the links for most of these reports are in the notes document, or they're embedded in the slides if you go into the slides. So early this year, the OECD updated a recommendation from a couple of decades ago about access to research data from public funding. And this report is worth noting because it really highlights the need to strengthen digital research capacities and the critical role for revised incentive and reward systems. So I encourage you to look at that one if you're after that kind of information. And then my last slide, thanks to Mia. There's 2 other reports hot off the press. The first one is on reducing the precarity of academic research careers. It was only released a few days ago. And it focuses on postdoctoral researchers in fixed term roles and the challenges that they face in terms of the precarious nature of their employment and some of the ways in which that can be addressed. So certainly that looks at the need to embrace and recognize that we have people with a whole lot of different skill sets coming through in an open science environment, and we're not necessarily getting recognition for it. And lastly, the OECD's STI Outlook 2021, the chapter 3 also has some more explanation of all these kinds of issues and might give you some good resources on arguing internally of the need to continue to prioritise this. So that's my overview of some of the OECD issues. If you had any particular questions on that, you can put them in the chat and I'll try and answer them as we're going through the next talk. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Michelle. We have Irina with us. She's our next speaker. Let me just move on to the next slide. So Irina, she's the Open Access Program Manager at EIFL, and she has also been the rapporteur of the EOSC Skills and Training Working Group. She's going to speak to us about the report that the working group has released at the beginning of the year. So take it away, Irina. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Timur and Michelle, and we have other colleagues from EOSC Skills and Training Working Group, so please chip in if I'm missing something. And what I'd like to do today is to have a look at an institutional angle of this report. And if we could go to the next slide, please. The report includes 4 priority areas or major sections, and the first one is about developing the next generation of fair and open science professionals. Then it looks at collaborations in Europe to enhance digital skills for fair and open science. There is also a chapter about improving discoverability of learning and training resources via catalogs, and then a chapter on the national approaches. And if we pick an institutional angle, I suggest that we focus on actors and skills and training needs, on Competence Centres approaches, and on this last national digital skills chapter. And if we could go to the next slide, please. These are 7 recommendations that we came up with, and the first one is a framework of actors for EOSC. Their skills, competencies, and training needs. Then coordination and alignment of relevant skills curricula and training frameworks on the European level, encouraging and supporting a competence center approach as a framework for increased coordinated provision of training, facilitating increased integration and fair and open science courses with university qualifications, and that was also mentioned as the area where there are least actions yet. Then building and learning and training catalog, including it in the EOSC interoperability framework. And the last recommendation is an approach that we suggest as an EOSC skills and training leadership program that would help to improve coordination, advise national and institutional decision makers, and also advocate for inclusion of skills and training into major European and national funding instruments. On my next slide, you could see recommendations which are specific to universities and research organizations. And Michelle also mentioned them in her talk. The first step is understanding the importance of training and identifying gaps. And it's great that most of you did that already for your institutions. And then, of course, a challenge for us is to keep in mind this diversity of needs and try to cater for that. Consider establishing a competence center or another framework for hub for providing training at institutional level. And then, of course, as it was mentioned by you, the reasons of joining this meeting, identifying what's already available and reusing and sharing your training materials and considering aligned approaches on the national and European level. The next slide, please. So you've probably seen these 10 EOSC roles that we identified, and they are described in the first chapter of this report, together with their list of required skills and training needs. This first chapter also covers roles in the context of organization, and Leonard is on the call and he coordinated this chapter and he could provide more details if you have questions. Then the next chapter, and that's the next slide, describes a competence center approach, and we borrowed this concept from Ferris Fair report, and we looked at organizational models of competence centers at universities, national bodies, research infrastructures, and professional associations. And we conducted 23 interviews and included short case studies looking at skills and competencies focus and how training approaches are aligned on the national European level, whether there is any formal certification and qualifications assigned, and then what governance, business models, and sustainability approaches, and successful examples of national and European alignments. And on my next slide, you can see some of the recommendations that we included on the competence centers. So it's again addressing gaps and identifying knowledge and skills to be taught and learned, thinking about appropriate governance, business models, and alignment when you're setting up your training hub or competence center, and then thinking how to maximize interoperability, fairness, and usage of your learning and training resources and alignment on the national level. And on my next slide, you see some examples of competence centers that we talked to, examples of organizational models, approaches to certification. So either through embedding fair data and open science training in curricular, and also through the lifelong learning programs, for example, for doctoral students, through transversal skills programs or interbachelor's and master degrees. Also training programs for PhD students, project coordinators, and also this open science fabric, which is an interesting approach of on-demand training provided by Lille University libraries. And then some examples of national level collaborations between competence centers in Greece, in France, in Serbia, in Ireland, and in Switzerland, where universities, research infrastructures, and other players collaborate. So you can read more about that in the second chapter. And then my next slide are examples from the last chapter on national skills, policies and strategies. And although this chapter addresses national state of the art and needs, I think there is a role for institutions to play. And you can see a list of challenges that LDK consultants who wrote this national skills chapter identified, and those challenges are on the national level, but many of them would also work for the institutional context. And because of those challenges on the national level, developments are also not so quick on the institutional level. And one of them is the fact that fair and open science isn't part of university curricula or other training systems yet. And then on the next slide, some recommendations that could address those challenges and gaps. And that's the leadership program that I mentioned that could help advocating for change. And it's interesting that we have an agent of change on the call. Would be great to hear from this person. And on my next slide, you can see some examples. What could we do together? Because that was also one of the reasons why we're joining this call today. So it would be good if we could work together on evaluating the effectiveness of skills and training policies and initiatives which we have now, and try to work together to align relevant skills, curricula, and training frameworks on the national and ideally on the European level as well. And of course, rewards and recognition framework was mentioned, and there are some developments on that in the EOSC Association, and it would be wonderful if we could have an aligned approach on that sometime soon. And then on my next slide, there are recommendations on setting up coordination networks, and at some point we were discussing perhaps a network of competence centers that could work together, help each other. Also, of course, this catalog of learning and training materials that is discussed in one of the report's chapters. And then thinking about governance structures for training provision. And then on my final slides are recommendations for links to LDK reports and recommendations to EOSC were on the previous slide. So that's all I wanted to share with you, and that's the discussion part now, and we can either talk, and if you want to talk, please raise your hand, and we have shared Google document which lists 4 questions that you see on the screen. What are the approaches that you are currently implementing? Are you facing any challenges or barriers? Are there any collective next steps that we can take? And then in the end, it would be wonderful if you could share one actionable takeaway that you are considering to do. So now it's really up to you, and please raise your hand or write a question in the chat.
Thank you very much, Irina. Michelle, do you want to take over? I think you might want to speak more on the specific questions.
Sure, I was going to facilitate a discussion for the last 10 minutes that we have, because we really wanted to ensure that this webinar included an opportunity for all of you to share some of the things that you're doing, to share where you've got best practice examples that we can all learn from, or where you're having particular challenges that others can feel relieved perhaps to know that they're not alone in facing, and then we can think about how to solve together. So if you go to the Google Doc or the notes document, which has been pasted again into the chat, there are the 4 questions listed there, and we encourage you to add some of your thoughts to each of those questions. If we start with what are the approaches that you're implementing, and if you're comfortable, you can also add your name and or organisation. So we'd be interested to know who's focusing on what at the moment. Are you creating another digital skills framework that's specific for your discipline? Are you working on policy at a national level, or for your organisation to do with career structures? And I realised that when I was talking to the last Menti slide during my presentation, I read it incorrectly. So the question had been which areas have the least action, and then I gave a commentary as if they were the areas that were having the most action. So we'll have to mentally reverse all the comments that I made there. So based on that, we might expect to see here people saying that they are in fact focusing a lot on the first 2 things from the OECD report, on defining the skills needed and the frameworks, on looking on training. And in fact, we would see less work being done at the moment on broader enablers such as policy or organisational culture, and less on the career structures and rewards. So we've got a couple of examples coming in, and if you've got a fantastic example that you'd really like to speak to, please also raise your hand and we can unmute you so that you can talk us through it.
And I think it would be great to hear from those who said that they are on level 2 of Michelle's metrics, that they are developing some activities. It would be great to hear a bit more about that.
So good to see. The first one is on delivering data science skills to early career researchers, that's a focus. Utilising research data management frameworks. It's always fantastic to see more and more work being done on research data management. And of course, there's so many excellent RDA interest groups and working groups working on different parts of that. Domain-specific upskilling in open source tools and fair assessment. Yeah, there's certainly a lot more work that needs to be done on domain-specific skills and frameworks. Some of that certainly exists, but there are some particular disciplines that would benefit from a lot more thinking on that. And as I said, if you're comfortable, you can add your name and our organisation at the end of whatever you're typing in, so that if anyone sees that someone's working on a similar issue or a similar type of program and wants to reach out to be able to share challenges and solutions, then that's an option as well. And implementing a mentorship program. Yeah, there's so many different ways that we can deliver skills training, and mentorship is certainly a good one, and particularly a good one to involve industry as well. We go down to the second question, are you facing any challenges or barriers? Financing, researchers would like the funding for themselves. Yes, there's still some cultural change needed at a whole range of levels, I guess, from an organisation allocating funding to supporting digital skills, to research teams, thinking about how they might spend their budgets, and what the breakdown could be and what percentage they would like to give to digital upskilling. Yeah, sustainability is obviously a huge one, and hopefully the COVID effect, the one silver lining, and perhaps for our sector, has been in increased emphasis on digital skills. When I gave a talk on the OECD work, I used to have a slide about the importance of digital skills, because sometimes that still had to be argued. But with COVID, we have certainly managed to prioritise that a bit more. So it'll be interesting to see how long budgets last for these kinds of things. If the kinds of programs that we interviewed for the OECD work that all had sustainability issues, if the environment gets better for them and organisational initiatives over the next couple of years, or at least continues to exist. Finding time for training, yes, certainly linked to issues in recognition of the training needed and the time it takes, and that's still often seen as an add-on in your workplace. There's a huge amount of activity in this sphere, but it's very distributed. Some institutions get the importance of the new roles, but others don't. How do we persuade management of higher education institutions to, I'm not sure, maybe that's a typo, to invest in more systematic training? Hopefully some of the resources that we've outlined today can give you some things that you can refer to and say there's international work being done and by EOSC in Europe to evidence the importance of this and give examples of other organisations who are doing it well, which perhaps means your organisation's being left behind if you still need to keep running some of those arguments. And finally, finding examples of approaches institutions are taking to develop. So people, if you're reading any of these and can think of resources or case studies that would be useful for people doing some of these particular or facing some of these barriers, then do cut and paste some in. Question 3, are there any collective next steps we can take? And this question, I guess, is based around the thinking that in RDA, so much of its work is grassroots initiatives. There's so many fantastic interest groups and working groups that start because people think, well, there's top-down things happening that might be outside my sphere of influence, but I can also see a community around me, in my country, in my discipline, with this particular concern. So what could we do together? So we were wondering where else there could be opportunities for new groupings to appear and think about what needs to be done. Demonstrating the value add of training. Trying to think if there's any RDA groups focusing on that at the moment. There's certainly ones looking at the value of roles like data stewards. So some of the value out of training would be implicit in that. Now, Stop Framing Fair is only about open.
Yes, there are several groups under the RDA that address the skills and training issues, also credit and rewards, which is obviously connected to that. We're going to share a couple of links to those as there are good forums where all of these issues can be brought forward and addressed.
And the final question there is framed in such a way as to encourage each of you to think about what you've learned today and how you can use it. We all know it's fantastic to take in all this information, and it's even better if you can turn it into action. So thinking right here, right now, how can I use some of this? Am I going to commit to going and reading a part of one of those reports, or to using one of the statistics that I've heard today in a note that I'm going to send to someone in my team to help them understand the importance of this, or if there are some other people on the call you'd like to contact. So you can think about that in your own time, and I'll hand back to Tamia.
Yes, actually, one of the things would be to look out. You've just mentioned the RDA groups working on skills and training, so that can be one of the things that you can also do. Join those groups and see how they push forward these solutions, and are looking at the challenges not only at the organizational level but also at national and international, and how these sort of frameworks that are a consistent approach across the board and across disciplines can be adopted. I see people are adding other points to also question number 2 and to the first one on the things that you are implementing. If anyone would like to speak to those, we would be happy to unmute and have a conversation on this. I saw that our colleagues working on an initiative called Terms for Fair have actually, I think, recently launched a sort of a solution, or I'll let them explain a little bit better what this is more precisely about. I think it's developed under the CoData work. I don't know, Victoria, would you like to speak to that, or maybe Laura?
Hi, it's Laura here. Victoria, please chip in. Just to say, Terms for Fair Skills is Adoptology, which works to describe the skills for fair. I guess it's fairly self-explanatory. If you'd like to go to the links that Victoria and I shared in the chat, that would be great. We had some funding up until February of this year from the EOSC Secretariat, and we're very grateful for that. So we have the terminology now at a proof of concept level, and we're working hard to try and find ongoing funding for the next steps to make it more usable. But I'm very welcome to I'm very keen to take any questions. You can contact me at this email address in the chat, or you can obviously contact Victoria as well if you'd like to.
That's very useful. Thank you very much, Laura. Yeah, we know addressing the terms and not only that, the variety of the resources that are available out there and trying to sort of navigate this very diverse landscape is quite challenging.
Yeah, and to try and give people a common language to describe and compare different resources so that we can help people to find the stuff they're looking for and to make it more usable.
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the areas. I was just looking if anyone has actually highlighted that among the challenges and barriers, but if they haven't, we do know nonetheless that that's one of the challenges. And I think that was also one of the drivers behind the bill around the EOSC skills and roles framework that is supposed to identify all the various roles that are sort of engaged in this and try to push forward for a common way of looking at this, and obviously using this as a common language. Okay, thank you very much for all your input on this. Thank you, Laura.
And I also added.
I see you have added a comment in the chat that you're interested to hear the counter argument to persuading HEI's management of the importance of training in this area.
Yeah. So yeah, I kind of I kind of put down that bullet point. Then somebody who's kind of just added in a point here, which is the motivation should be there already. Why the huge need to argue? And the point I would say is that, yeah, there is absolutely a huge need to argue. There are clearly some institutions, Delft, Gdansk, some Irish institutions, which are saying, yes, we need to support this. But we're also seeing that there are gaps there. And I'm sort of surprised, to be honest, that there's an opinion here which says, no, we don't need to do that. We can continue having these nice little chats, until the cows come home. But at the end of the day, we have to face people who look at bottom lines and say, yes, we need to do this. You need to support these kinds of activities. And that's I'm sorry, we have to get our hands dirty at some level.
Absolutely. So there is a very clear case for that, as you mentioned, it's surprising that that there are still opinions that that go against it. But just like every other cultural shift, it takes time, and changes are slow to come in. But we hope that these sort of discussions are nonetheless very, very important, and they need to happen. Okay, I see that people are still adding comments to the shared notes, and I thank you very much for that. Thank you, Hugh, as well for raising that that point. I think we're right at the top of the hour, so we're gonna close the meeting now. But we'll share all the presentation links and the notes, and also the recording with you shortly after the webinar. Thank you very much for participating, and very much thank you to our speakers, Michelle and Irina. This has been very informative. We hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you, and I hope we can continue this conversation at the EOSC Symposium